as well as the Yale School of Public Health. So just want to let everyone know that this is being recorded. So my name is Carrie Racian. I'm a senior research scientist at the Yale School of Public Health, and I am the director of the Firearm Injury Prevention Consortium there. Today's programming is brought to you both by UConn Arms and the Yale's Firearm Injury Prevention Consortium. We are proud to co-host this webinar series. So on target, for those of you who don't know, who may be joining us for the first time, it occurs about once a month, and it provides an opportunity for the dissemination and discussion of emerging gun injury prevention work. The seminar is open to all researchers, policymakers, practitioners, and anyone who just has a curiosity and wants to know more about this field. We also, in the spirit of openness, welcome researchers from all interdisciplinary and backgrounds. So please know that if you would like to present, if you have work that is relevant in this space, we would love to hear from you. And later on, I'll drop information about how you can let us know that you'd like to present in the chat. I'll also put everything I'm going to say, it'll go in the chat, but just so you also know, our next On Target is Wednesday, October the 8th, and we'll feature a good friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Panka Benchik, who also just so happens to be a co-author on this paper, but that was total coincidence. But today I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Jesse Bruhn, an assistant professor of economics at Brown University and an affiliate of the Annenberg Institute. He describes himself as a labor economist who studies the economics of education and crime. Prior to becoming an economist, he spent 4 years as an active duty enlisted soldier in the United States Army. Thank you for your service, Jesse. And 1 year as a mathematics educator in Springfield, Massachusetts, just up the road from us in the public school system. So he brings a whole lot of different life experiences as well to his work. So his presentation today is community engagement with law enforcement after high-profile acts of police violence, which was published in the American Economic Review Insights, and I'll also be posting the ungated version of that paper in our chat. One last thing for anybody that's local, we have an event on September 25th at the Legislative Office Building in Hartford, where we will have a screening of the Tennessee 11 and a panel discussion and reception afterwards. So please feel free to join us to continue how we might have respectful dialogue concerning gun injury policy in our society. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jesse, and I will be listening, but also posting in the chat. Jesse, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much to the organizers, especially for inviting me to share this work with all of you, and to everyone in the audience who's come to listen to me talk for a little bit today. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen now and probably fail miserably because that tends to be how these things go, but we'll see what happens. Can you all see my PowerPoint deck or my PDFs?
Yep.
It looks as it is supposed to, right? It is not like a collection of slides.
Correct. You got it. It's perfect.
Fantastic. Okay. So first, let me just start off by saying I'm very happy. I'm an economist by training. We tend to have very lively seminars with questions throughout, and so if folks want to ask some questions, please do so. You can either throw them in the chat or kind of do like the raise hand emoji, and I'll try to grab you. So again, my name is Jesse Bruhn. I'm an assistant professor in the econ department here at Brown. The title of this paper is Community Engagement with Law Enforcement After High-Profile Acts of Police Violence, and it is joint with Desmond, Panka, and Alora. And let me just start this talk off by just telling you in plain simple language what we do. So what we're going to show is a sharp and persistent increase in acoustically detected gunshots, coupled with declining, stagnating 911 call volume immediately following the murder of George Floyd. We're going to show you that this occurs in both white and black neighborhoods across 13 major U.S. cities. It's going to be robust to alternative measures of crime and crime reporting. We can show it's not driven by any kind of ceiling on a willingness of individuals in these neighborhoods to report crime. And it's not going to be accompanied by large changes in police response times. And it's going to last too long, this decline, to be plausibly attributed to the subsequent protest movement. At the same time, we're going to leverage some publicly available survey data to document a sudden increase in the likelihood of people who are victims of crime who choose to not report those crimes with the stated reason that they mistrust their local police. And we're going to put all this evidence together and we're going to offer an interpretation, which is that these high profile acts of police violence are damaging community engagement and trust in law enforcement. Okay, so that's the paper in a nutshell. Let me zoom out a little bit and kind of motivate why we think this fact is interesting and important and vital. Okay, so it is probably well known to folks on this Zoom, but just to kind of say it out loud, use of force is now a routine part of the American law enforcement system. We're seeing something like in a typical year, there's 1,000 police killings, roughly 5% of all gun-related homicides in the United States. Half of those killings are happening where the person being killed is a racial minority. Fully 40% of the victims have no gun. And in practice, it's rare for any kind of accountability to happen for these high-profile acts of police violence. There's roughly 15,000 police killings from 2005 to 2019. This led to 140 arrests and only 50 documented convictions. Okay, and there's evidence that these events have significant social spillovers. Okay, there's a long history of discourse in legal theory and in sociology arguing that these type of events can foster institutional distrust, create legal cynicism or estrangement, and even in many cases lead to like actual, as we've seen in recent years, actual episodes of urban unrest. Broadening out to look at a wider range of outcomes, there's evidence that these can lead children to reduce their educational attainment and cause increased engagement by local voters in the wake of these incidents. And I think even more broadly, there's this kind of story that has been studied and sort of floating around the media and the press for years, that perversely these high-profile acts of police violence can actually change the way civilians trust and interact with the police. Which, if you think about the way that police are able to execute their job, critically relies on the willingness of individuals to report the crimes that they see in their neighborhood. And so there's sort of this vicious cycle that we imagine might be happening where these acts of police violence lead to declines in trust, lead to declines in reporting, and in turn reduce the efficacy of law enforcement and their ability to police the very real crimes that are happening in neighborhoods across the country. Okay? Now, the existing literature on this question of whether and to what degree incidents of police violence reduce trust and engagement with law enforcement, I think, generously it's mixed at best. Okay, to just talk you through some of the existing work, this very famous study from Matthew Desmond and co-authors in 2016 found that the police beating of Frank Jude in Milwaukee led to a reduction in 911 calls. Another sociologist comes back 4 years later, looks at the same incident, the same data, the same research design, and comes to the opposite conclusion. Okay. More broadly, social scientists have looked at, for example, use of force incidents in New York City on the likelihood of receiving a 311 call for service. These are like the calls for like repairing potholes in the city. They find that call volume goes down in the aftermaths of these incidents. Another study taking a similar approach in LA finds no effect. Okay, and I think fundamentally, a core challenge facing this entire body of work is the fact that 911 calls don't just represent individuals' willingness to report crimes. They actually represent both the intersection of actual crimes happening on the ground and the community's willingness to report the crimes that they see to law enforcement. And so just at a really basic level, all of these patterns I'm talking about up top, it is sort of unclear whether these lower 911 or 311 call volumes are implying a reduced trust or reduced willingness to report, or whether they're just indicative of the fact that crime goes down in the aftermath of an incident of police violence. So how would you like to get around this sort of key limitation. What would you ideally like to do? You'd like to benchmark these changes in 911 call volume to some kind of ground truth measure of how crime is actually changing on the ground. That'll let you know for a given criminal incident how likely an individual was to report it. Now, I want to be fair to existing work on this topic. People are very aware of this limitation, and they're using things like local crime data as a way to try to get a benchmark measure of these ground truth. But the reality is that these local crime data are also reliant on civilian and police reporting in order to make it into the data sets that they're using to try to construct these benchmarks. And so at the end of the day, I think this is a limitation that has not been successfully addressed in the literature until now. Okay, so what are we going to do? How are we going to try to overcome this challenge? We're going to benchmark the 911 calls that we see in our data to acoustically detected gunshots that are recorded using fixed array microphone systems that have been installed in many major cities across the country. And I'll say in a few slides in more detail exactly how the system works and how it allows us to overcome this limitation. But just know for now that this is going to allow us to definitively remove human reporting behavior as a mediator for deciding what is the ground truth benchmark of how crime is evolving in the aftermath of these incidents. Okay. Other work has used this data, to diagnose sort of, for example, important and consequential reporting biases that are coming through in these standard crime data. And I see a question. Carrie, go ahead. I think you might still be on mute. I don't know if you're.
Thank you. I didn't realize that. Yeah. So I will try to help with the questions as we go along, because that's a new culture for this seminar. So how should we be thinking about, and I know you'll get to this, but like, how should we be thinking about the fact that we know that shot spotter placement is like endogenous to other crime levels? Those are not placed randomly throughout the city, but are often, done as a strategic investment in how to, combat crime. So as we like think about this question and getting this ground truth, like how should we be thinking about that?
Yeah, so I think the way we think about this is that there's going to be a trade-off here between sort of internal and external validity in terms of what we're going to be able to conclude. At the end of the day, we're only going to have this sort of ground truth benchmark, as you point out, for the places that have had this acoustic gunshot detection technology installed. These tend to be higher crime areas, higher share lower SES resident, higher share African American. Okay, and so at the end of the day, you should think of all these results as reporting to these neighborhoods, or applying directly to these neighborhoods. That said, like many cities, for example, have rolled out this technology at sort of like a citywide level, and so it is not like we are purely limited to like the most high crime neighborhood in LA to talk about these results. And I'm going to show you, if there's time, some heterogeneity by places that have high and low sort of crime reporting at baseline. So you might, and we're going to find sort of broadly similar results in both settings. And so I think it's, beyond just the internal validity here, we do think this is likely to generalize, although obviously that's going to be area for future work. Did I answer your question, Carrie? Great. Excellent. Okay, and so I think just returning to a little bit to the literature here, I think we're building on this sort of exciting literature that's leveraging these novel sources of violent crime data by offering this kind of what we're going to call the call to shot ratio as a natural sort of revealed preference measure of attitudes about an engagement with the police. And finally, equipped with this sort of novel way of benchmarking the ground truth around what's happening with crime, I think we're also going to directly contribute to this literature on police violence by understanding how our improved measure of reporting evolves in the context of a national event of unprecedented salience. Great. Let me talk to you a little bit about the data. Okay, so the acoustic gunshot detection technology is an audio recording system that's going to allow us to capture both the time and location of gunshots. Now, there's some research out there suggesting that, like, sort of at the level of the physics at which these things work, these systems are able to detect something like 80 to 99% of gunshots in conditional on detecting them, triangulates about 91% of them to within 40 feet of the location where they actually happen. And I want to acknowledge that this technology has become incredibly controversial. Okay. I think there's been some public reporting that the many of the companies involved in the provision of this technology have a relationship with law enforcement that are often the ones paying for this that, is maybe unprofessionally close. And there's been a series of ongoing lawsuits alleging that various police departments have sort of misused and abused this technology as sort of an excuse to over-police communities that are already, potentially suffering from problems related to over-policing. It's also the case that despite the sort of accuracy at the level of physics, it's sort of unavoidable to have false positives here from things like fireworks and helicopters. Well, I guess helicopters less so in our data, but things like fireworks on dates of celebration. We're going to remove all the major holidays where fireworks are likely to happen from our data to try to account for this. That said, despite the controversy, I just want to highlight that for the purposes of what we are doing here, I think a lot of the controversy centers around how police use this data in conjunction with the way they enact law enforcement in specific communities. That has no direct bearing on whether or not the technology itself is able to reliably detect gunshot, and to the extent that there is sort of mismeasurement in these acoustically detected gunshots, what we're really going to be relying on for the empirical analysis is that any sort of trends in that mismeasurement are not sort of different, changing immediately in the aftermath of a high-profile act of police violence. And so, at least at the level of answering the core research question in this paper, we think this data is fairly reliable for that purpose. But I don't want anything here to be taken as an endorsement of sort of the broader use of this technology. I think that's still a subject of ongoing research and up for debate. Okay. We're going to pair that with 911 calls that we've collected. These are publicly posted from many major cities across the country. We're going to limit to 911 calls that have been specifically routed to police departments. And you should think of this data on average as containing information about the location of the individual who made the 911 call, and then sort of incident description fields. Our analysis sample is going to cover the 13 US cities where we were able to recover both publicly available acoustic gunshot records along with the 911 data over the period that overlaps with the murder of George Floyd. And so you can kind of see the list right here. These are large US cities spanning the East, the Northeast, Midwest, South, and the West Coast. And so I think, caveating the sort of limitations that Carrie highlighted earlier, this is about as representative as you can get. Okay. We're going to then impose some sample restrictions. We're going to restrict ourselves to census tracts that had at least one acoustically detected gunshot. We, can't implement this idea for places that don't have the acoustic gunshot detection technology. And consistent with those sources of mismeasurement, we're going to exclude things like New Year's Day, New Year's Eve, and the 4th of July. Our final analysis sample, our preferred measure of sort of crime reporting is going to be the ratio of total 911 calls to detected gunshots in a given census tract at a point in time. Okay, we're going to end up with about 12.1 million 911 calls over this period, 55,000 detected shots in 2020. Okay. Yes, please, Carrie, jump on in.
Mute myself this time. Do you know if the 911 calls are for, right, like the underlying reason? Like you might think that some types of 911 calls are more correlated with gunshots than others, right? Like calling because my cat is in the tree or something, or a medical emergency or anything like that. Is there any way that you can like refine the signal you're getting from the 911 calls?
Great question. So first, I do want to say we can see whether the 911 call operator routed the call to a hospital or like a ambulance or a police department, and we are going to restrict the calls that were routed to a police department. So I think that's going to cut out a lot of the mismeasurement that you have in mind. We're also going to do a ton of robustness to looking at different subsets of the 911 calls based exactly on how they've been characterized. What I'm about to show you here in just a sec as sort of the first bite at the apple is actually going to be 911 calls where, so the data, underlying data is like a little messy and it's highly heterogeneous by city. We have gone through and used like regular expressions to try to specifically detect calls that mention gunshots or that seem to be related to gunshots. That's what we're going to kind of show you first. But then our baseline measure is going to expand out from that. I think because conceptually, what we'd really like is to have kind of like all crime in the denominator of our measure and like all calls about crime in the numerator. And so it's going to get us a little bit closer to that sort of conceptual benchmark. We're also going to show robustness to within the 911 calls logs. You can sometimes detect calls that have been triggered by like an automated alarm system. So like someone breaks into Walmart, the alarm goes off. No one actually calls the police. A robot calls the police, and we get similar results doing that. And so I think, to your question, we've done a lot of work to try to convince ourselves that this is not something that is specific to kind of the way we've constructed this particular measure and is robust to other sensible alternative decisions. Awesome. Great. So let me show you the kind of first key finding of the paper, which is that gunshot reporting is going to drop by roughly 50% in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. Ooh. Okay. So what I'm showing you here on the left, on the x-axis, is time measured in weeks for the entirety of the year 2020. The vertical dotted dashed line denotes the week that the COVID national emergency was declared. The red line denotes the week that the murder of George Floyd occurred. And the green line denotes the end of or the rough end of the subsequent protest movement, which we date using some publicly available data capturing the time and location of protests in the US as a way to date the end of that. Each dot represents the average across our entire sample of census tracts of the number of 911 calls that were specifically using these regex techniques mentioning gunfire, divided by the number of acoustically detected gunshots. And what we can see is that in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, right after this red line, a sudden and dramatic decline in the likelihood that these gunshots are being reported to the police. Okay. As I previewed our discussion with Carrie, I think like this is one way to tackle constructing a measure of sort of revealed preference measure of trust in the police. I think, there are some limitations here. For example, we're not confident in our ability to accurately characterize the 911 calls related to gunshots. More broadly, I think in the ideal conceptual version of this measure that I outlined earlier, it wouldn't just be gunshots. We'd have kind of all crime in the denominator and all 911 calls related to crime in the numerator, because you might imagine there might be different sensitivities to people's willingness to report depending on the type of crime. And so to try to move closer to that ideal measure, we construct an alternative version that puts all 911 calls routed to the police department in the numerator and divides by the number of gunshots that have been acoustically detected in the denominator. Now, as long as the rest of crimes that are happening are moving in proportion with gunshots in the denominator, this will be correct in terms of the time series patterns that we would see if we could construct kind of our ideal measure. So doing this alternative version, what you can see is something very similar. This version actually, you can see a little bit of a drop happening after the COVID emergency, and then again, the sudden and sharp decline following the murder of George Floyd. Okay. Now, as I also previewed to Carrie, we've done, yes, please keep them coming. Oh, you got the mute on again.
Other people can ask questions too. So when I undo the hand, like I feel like I've done the thing already, but I haven't. I've done the unmute. So I wrote a few COVID papers, but in a different topic on child maltreatment and domestic violence, which is my area. And I'm just wondering how, right now you have the week of the national emergency on there, but like, what about other sort of COVID quarantines that were going on and how that might have affected calls routed to police, right? We think calls went down to police for lots of reasons in some of those national emergencies. And so I know you're norming this, but like, how should we think about like the COVID quarantines that might have been, or whatever that period is called? I don't even know. I'd like to forget it, but whatever that period is called, how should we think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I want to make sure is super clear in these figures is that unlike a lot of econ applied micro research, this is not like a diff and diff or an event study. Okay, we're not comparing, we're not using any kind of cross city variation here. Okay, well, this is just raw time series data. We found this pattern so striking, we just felt it was incumbent upon us to show it in the most raw form possible. So to the extent that you thought the timing of those things was like kicking in at different places and once, at different places and maybe leading to different changes in, 911 call reporting in like Los Angeles versus like New York, that's not going to show up here in the raw time series as a sudden drop around the murder of George Floyd. Now, that said, we were also worried, as you were, that, well, sorry, the second thing I'll say is that, if you thought this was all coming from COVID related changes, I would expect either in the graph on the left here or the graph on the right to see some kind of like trend shift that slowly moved, okay, or a sudden jump that stayed level, like what we actually observe, in a way that would lead to some sort of confounding relative to the week where George Floyd happened. And what you can see is that that's actually not the case. All the breaks that happen around the timing of George Floyd really are precise to the timing of George Floyd. And so it seems unlikely to us ex ante that this is really a story about like the sudden imposition. And I just think in the kind of actual record of when these things happened, there were not a lot of like additional, this is like the summer of protests, additional COVID emergencies being placed at the statewide level, precisely timed with the murder of George Floyd. The last thing I'll say is just to really nail this point home and make sure that we're not confounding anything related to COVID. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a specification that effectively summarizes the drop we're seeing in these figures, but controlling for Google mobility data at the census tract, or either the census tract or the city level. I need to go to the data appendix to remember which one. We published the paper's now published, so it's been a little while since I've been in the weeds on the appendix on this.
I think it's the census tract, if that's
Yeah, yeah,
helpful.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So we control for Google mobility trends at the census tract level. And so to the extent that you thought the imposition of these kind of quarantines would also change people's likelihood to kind of move around in their neighborhoods in various ways, that should soak up some of whatever confounding you might be worried about. I think big picture, we don't think that this is a COVID-19 story, mostly because the timing is so precise with when the George Floyd incident happens. Good question. Awesome. So again, I know this is an interdisciplinary audience, and so just like being economists, it would not be a complete paper without a litany of robustness checks and alternative specifications, just to convince ourselves that the interpretation I'm offering you is actually the interpretation that's warranted. We've talked about some of these already. Let me just walk them through quickly. In panel A here at the top, what I'm plotting here, or what I'm showing you in column 1, is just a simple time series regression with no controls, aligned with the specification that I'm showing you down here. And what this is really going to do is just measure the size of that decline I showed you on the preceding figure. The advantage of doing this in a regression setting is that then I can also add in different controls represented here by x sub t. Okay, and this is going to allow me to potentially pick up other spurious trends or sudden changes that might be responsible for the patterns I showed you on the preceding figure. And so as we move across columns, we can do things like control for trends over time. We find basically the same effect. We can add, as I previewed to Carrie a moment ago, these controls for Google mobility. Doesn't do much to our estimates. We can then layer on the number of 911 calls on the exact same date a year prior as a way to try to pick up some of these things related to seasonality. That doesn't do much. We can also control for the number of gunshots we observed on the exact same date in 2019, a year earlier. Again, trying to parse out the seasonality. It doesn't really do much. And then finally, if you thought there was seasonality that was really specific to reporting and not individually at the 911 call or gunshot level, we can sort of control for the same ratio in the prior year, and that doesn't do much as well. The other thing we can do to try to, poke at this and ask whether alternative stories might explain the patterns we're seeing in the data is estimate the size of this drop using alternative samples and ways of constructing the outcome variable. Okay, so the first one that I'm showing you here in column 1 of panel B changes the denominator. Again, in deference to the idea that these acoustically detected gunshots might have some mismeasurement, we can actually take publicly available data on gun violence casualties, use that in the denominator, and we also find large and sudden declines. We can, as I showed you pictorially on the other side, do this with the subset of 911 calls. We can specifically tie to gunshots. We also find large declines. You'll notice the magnitudes here are very different. We're changing the outcome variable. So in this column right here, or this row, we have the means. And if you actually do the kind of division, you'll see that as a proportional change. What we're finding here is actually like remarkably stable, regardless of the particular measure used. Okay, just want to point that out. In column 3, we can do what I mentioned earlier. We can replace the gunshots, or sorry, in addition to gunshots, we can also add these automated alarms, still find sudden declines. We can also, there's also a sort of less salient thing about the 911 call data, which is that actually a non-trivial amount of 911 calls are actually initiated by the police when they like radio for certain types of backup that essentially triggers a 911 report. We can specifically exclude those police initiated calls and just look at civilian calls. We also find large declines. And then finally, as I previewed before, we can split this to try to get a sense of kind of the external validity of these findings to places that had like above and below average reporting rates at baseline. And once again, we find that, the declines are substantial. One thing you might have thought is that maybe there are some communities where gunshots are so prevalent that like they've already hit kind of like a ceiling on their willingness to report crime. And that doesn't appear to be what's going on in our data. So big picture, this pattern is real, and it is, I think, clearly driven by the way crime reporting changed in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. Okay. Now, I argued to you at the beginning of this talk that the measure wasn't in addition to capturing reporting behavior, that this was that in turn that is a useful proxy for people's attitudes and overall trust towards the police. I've shown you the declines in reporting behavior. Now let me show you a little bit more work that justifies, I think, that broader interpretation. Okay, and the first thing I want to show you, it's actually like hard to find reliable survey data measuring police favorability. There's like various surveys over the year that have tried to do this, but some of them kind of go out of business. We found one that overlaps with the murder of George Floyd, although not the complete, kind of calendar year afterwards. And if you just plot the share of respondents in this survey, it's the firm's called Nationscape. You can do this across race categories. You can do it across, as one average of people reporting favorable or unfavorable views of the police. Perhaps unsurprisingly, what you see is a sharp decline in these favorability ratings and a sharp uptick in these unfavorability ratings across all groups. Again, with the red line here denoting the precise week of the George Floyd murder. More generally, we can then take this Nationscape data and we can record the share of people in each of our 13 major US cities. The geography of the Nationscape data is bigger, so we can't go quite as granular as the other analysis. We can calculate the share that say they have unfavorable views of the police and just ask how highly correlated is that with the call to shot ratio. And what you find is that places with a more unfavorable view of the police are less likely to call and report crimes. Again, suggesting that these really are a good proxy for these underlying feelings and attitudes. Okay, then I think perhaps most directly, we could also take some data from the National Crime Victimization Survey. This is a fantastic data set that I think is massively underutilized in at least the circles I travel in with respect to crime research, that asks people, that finds people who, that surveys people on whether or not they were a victim of a crime, and then conditional on being a victim, ask them a whole host of questions about the nature of the victimization. One of the things they ask people is, did you report this crime to the police? And then if you chose not to report the crime to the police, they ask you why. Okay, and so what we can do is again, running these time series regressions, look for changes in the reasons people report in this survey for not reporting crimes to the police. And what we find is a large increase in the likelihood of a non-report due to categories like survey responses that say things like, I didn't think the police would believe me. I think there's even one that specifically mentions the word trust. This is a combination of like 3 of the reasons that they could potentially give. Again, consistent with the idea that this is measuring something about changing in underlying trust. As a kind of placebo test, One of the categories, one of the reasons you can give is that you didn't report it due to a private concern, and we don't see a similarly large increase around the timing of George Floyd. Again, consistent with the idea that what's really happening is these changes in underlying attitudes and beliefs. Okay, so I think to sort of finish off the talk, let me give you oh yes, please, Carrie, dive in.
Going back to the non-report slide, um, do you find that that mistrust explains is like big enough to explain the sizes you're seeing?
So I think so we've not looked at that specifically. I think it's a little hard though because I
You
don't
know, I know they're different sources, but like and also is that like 1.5%? Like, how do I
yeah,
interpret
yeah, yeah. Sorry. This is this is not accurately contextualized. That's a 1.5 percentage point increase off a mean of about 8.4 percentage point.
Okay, yeah, okay. So
Okay.
that's
I
yeah.
think to your question, substantively, it's actually quite interesting. And having thought about it a minute, what we could do is throw this in as a that's probably why we can't do it. So I think what you'd ideally like to do is kind of chuck this in as sort of a bad control, if you will, and
Yeah.
ask how much of the decline in actual crime reporting loads onto the corresponding time series change and mistrust. These are at like fundamentally different levels of geography. I am actually not sure well, but that's not a good excuse either because we could just do everything at the nationwide level, and you'd have to sort of implicitly assume that the respondents in the survey are representative of like the 13 people in the city, but that's not a crazy assumption in the range of assumptions that economists sometimes make. It's an interesting question, and we could do it for sure. I would also be interested to see what that yields. But yeah, to your question, we've not done it yet. Okay. Um, And so let me just finish this with a what we view as a few kind of supplementary analyses that we think sort of shed a little bit of light, if not definitively answering some additional questions that we think are raised by these findings. So one, natural question I think is to what extent, the murder of George Floyd, I think, was a unique moment in American history. It was an event of unprecedented salience. It's not totally obvious that these kind of lower level, uh, persistent incidents of police violence that are happening every day in cities across the country are going to engender the same kind of reaction, even from the people who live in the neighborhoods where these things are occurring. So one thing we've tried to do is just ask, like, can we find other incidents in our data? Or can do these data overlap with other incidents that will allow us to explore this question? And so what we did is we took Google search call volume using this database for names that we found in the Mapping Police Violence database and identified the 5 other incidents of police violence that had the largest trough to peak search volume over this period, excluding people who were murdered who had the same name as like an NFL player, for example. This gives us a set of 5 other events that we would argue are particularly salient that overlap with the period of time where we can actually bring this data to bear on the question. And what we find is at least in these 13 cities, not evidence of similarly large declines. Okay, suggesting that salience in the kind of the national prevalence of the conversation about the murder of George Floyd may have contributed to the dramatic changes we saw in that instance. The one other, so that led us down this road of trying to ask, well, are there there were other events further back in time that we think engendered a similar level of national salience? The problem is a lot of the data we use to construct this time series doesn't go back that far. But for one city in our data, we are able to construct this measure far enough back in time to look at the murder of Michael Brown. And what we find is that for this one city, after the murder of Michael Brown, you also find a similarly large drop. Again, pointing to the idea that it's really about the salience. Now, again, this is all sort of like at these large city levels. We're looking at averages across all sorts of neighborhoods. I think an open question is to what extent does a incident that is very salient in your neighborhood change your perceptions? And that is something we're not able to look at using the data we have here. Finally, we also look, as I previewed at the beginning, most of these incidents, no one is ever held accountable, or even in incidents that seem to have lots of irregularities or where there was potentially misconduct, it's very rare for police to ever be held accountable. The murder of George Floyd is one of the rare incidents where the murderer faced some sort of justice. So you might think that seeing the legal system work in the way it's intended might restore some of that overall faith in the system and increase reporting. So you can plot this same time series around the conviction of George Floyd's murderer, and we don't, at least for this particular event, see any evidence that that's happening in the data. Great. So let me spend the last few moments I have in the talk sort of thinking a little bit more broadly about interpreting these results. Okay. And I previewed this a little bit at the beginning. There's sort of these long-standing legal theories about how these incidents interact with the criminal justice system. One of these theories is known as legal cynicism, and reading this quote that I think summarizes the general concept fairly adequately. The legal scholars define it as a cultural orientation in which the law and the agents of its enforcement are viewed as illegitimate, unresponsive, and ill-equipped to ensure public safety. Contrast that with a second way that the legal scholars have wrestled with these issues, which they refer to as legal estrangement. Again, reading from one of the leading lights in this area, it is described as a theory of detachment and eventual alienation from the law's enforcers. It reflects the intuition among many people in poor communities of color that the law specifically operates to exclude them from society. And I think this paper is at best a sort of existence proof that highly salient acts of police violence can engender legal cynicism, can change the way that individual people trust and engage with law enforcement in their communities. And I think this is important to document because, as we talked about at the beginning, this can directly damage an important input of effective law enforcement and raises questions about the long-run efficacy of the legal system. Bill Breton, the famous NYPD commissioner, famously said, "Police are at their most effective when they work in partnership with the community, responding to the needs of the citizens." But I think that the historical ongoing contribution of institutional structures that engender these less nationally salient incidents is a wide open question. We don't really know about the broader structures in society that contribute to this broader notion of legal estrangement. And I think that's a key open area for future work. So thank you very much for your time and attention. This has really been great to share this work with you. And if you have additional questions or thoughts or comments, I'd be super excited to hear them.
We can certainly open it up. You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask. You can feel free to pop your question into a chat if you're not somewhere where you can say your question. My dogs are like, there's a FedEx man and they might bark, for example. So if you have that concern, you can obviously feel free to pop it into the chat, but we welcome questions. While you're thinking of your question, so Jesse, I have another question for you that was actually my first question when we started, but gets to this Bill Bratton quote about partnership. And so, there's like different margins of partnership, right? There's calling and reporting, but there's also working with the police to help solve crimes, be witnesses in crimes, right? Which affects clearance rates, conviction rates, sort of all of those other things that happen after a crime is reported. I'm wondering if you were able to look at any of those other legal outcomes, or like what you might have found, if they didn't make it into the paper.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And that's like exactly the kind of narrative that inspired us to pursue this paper to begin with. As often happens with these studies, sometimes you have to compromise a little bit on the original goal because I think we would love to have looked at that. I don't think we had the data we needed to go after those questions specifically. But I think very much in the back of our minds as we did this is this idea that like one of the reasons clearance rates are so low in sort of hard-struck lower SES urban communities might precisely be because the people there have a history of, watching police commit acts of violence against the folks who live there, and so they are sort of unwilling to trust and place their faith in law enforcement, and, for example, come to the stand as a witness. So, very long-winded way of saying, great question, and I would love it if someone could write that version of this paper.
And I know that we do at least have one prosecutor on this call. So if she wanted to say anything, she'd be welcome to. But if she doesn't, that's okay too. And so if anyone else has questions or even just like general comments about the work, I asked a lot of questions, which has been great, but I want to open it up. Okay, well, Jesse, do you have anything else you want to say that you forgot about? And oh, our prosecutor says she does not have any questions. If there's anything that you wanted to say or add that maybe you didn't get into because you were worried about time compression.
No, no, just thank you all again for having me out. It's been fun to share this work with a broad audience.
Awesome. Okay, well, with that, we will see everybody hopefully on September 25th if you are local at the Tennessee 11 screening and panel conversation. The overall event is called Disarming the Debate, so we'd love to see you there. If you are unable to join us in person, we hope to see you back virtually for our next On Target in October, again with Panka, who is a co-author on this paper. So to give you an idea, it'll definitely be a good presentation as well. So thanks everybody and enjoy your Wednesday. And thank you especially to Jesse for sharing this work with us. I appreciate it.